The bed frame splintered with a thunderous crack that echoed through the Wyoming night, sending John McKenna tumbling to the floor with his new bride Margaret landing squarely on top of him, all 200 pounds of her. "Well," she gasped, her face flushed crimson in the lamplight, "I suppose that's one way to consummate a marriage." This wasn't the delicate, slim bride he'd ordered from Chicago. No, Margaret O'Connor was everything he hadn't asked for, and exactly what would save his life before winter's end. Welcome to the wild frontier where mail-order brides don't always match their descriptions, and sometimes that's the best mistake a man can make. Stay with me till the end of this tale, and drop a comment about where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these frontier stories travel. The autumn wind cut across the Wyoming plains like a butcher's knife, sharp and unforgiving, as John McKenna stood on the platform of the Cheyenne Depot. His weathered hands gripped the crumpled telegram so tight the paper threatened to tear. "Arriving Tuesday. Stop. M. O'Connor. Stop." That was all it said. No mention of delays, no apologies for being 3 weeks late. Just those clipped words that had kept him waiting at this godforsaken station for the better part of the morning. Around him, the usual chaos of the depot swirled, cowboys herding cattle into stock cars, merchants haggling over freight charges, ladies in traveling clothes clutching their carpet bags close. But John stood apart from it all, a statue carved from prairie dust and stubborn pride, his gray eyes fixed on the horizon where the iron rails disappeared into heat shimmer. "Train's coming!" shouted the station master, and John's heart performed an uncomfortable dance in his chest. He tugged at his collar, suddenly aware that his best shirt, the one he'd saved for church and funerals, was already damp with nervous sweat. This was idiotic, he told himself. He was a grown man of 38, not some green boy courting his first girl. He'd been married before, knew what it meant to share a life with a woman. But Martha had been dead 2 years now, and the ranch was falling apart without a woman's touch. The locomotive's whistle pierced the air, black smoke billowing into the crystal blue sky. John straightened his shoulders, trying to recall the description from the matrimonial agency's letter. Miss O'Connor is 26 years of age, of Irish descent, skilled in household management and cooking. She stands 5 feet 4 inches, of slender build, with auburn hair and gray eyes. She comes highly recommended by her previous employers in Chicago, where she worked as a governess. Slender. That was important. Martha had been slender, delicate as a bird. She'd moved through their house like a whisper, never disturbing his work, never demanding more than he could give. That's what he needed again, someone who could cook, clean, maybe give him a son to carry on the ranch, but who wouldn't upset the careful balance he'd built around his grief. The train groaned to a stop, steam hissing from the engine like an angry dragon. Passengers began to disembark. A family with too many children, a gambler in a threadbare suit, 2 saloon girls heading to the territories. John scanned each face, looking for auburn hair, for that slender silhouette he'd imagined 100 times over the past month. "Mr. McKenna?" The voice came from behind him, rich and melodious with just a hint of Irish lilt. John turned, and his prepared greeting died in his throat. The woman standing before him was substantial. There was no other word for it. Where he'd expected delicate, she was robust. Where he'd imagined willowy, she was sturdy as an oak. She stood exactly as tall as promised, but she must have weighed close to 200 pounds, with full hips, a generous bosom that strained against her travel dress, and arms that looked like they could wrestle a calf to the ground. Her face was pretty enough, creamy skin dusted with freckles, those promised gray eyes that seemed to see right through him, and yes, auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun. But Lord Almighty, she was not what he'd ordered. "I'm Margaret O'Connor," she said, extending a gloved hand. When he didn't immediately take it, her eyes narrowed slightly. "You are Mr. McKenna, aren't you? The agency gave me your photograph." John finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm John McKenna." He took her hand, surprised by the firm grip. "You're Miss O'Connor? That's what I just said, isn't it?" A smile played at the corners of her mouth, but there was steel behind it. "Though I suspect I'm not quite what you were expecting." The understatement of the century. John cleared his throat, acutely aware that several people at the depot were watching their exchange with interest. In a town this small, Gossip spread faster than wildfire. By evening, everyone would know that John McKenna's mail-order bride had arrived, and she was built like a prize heifer. "The wagon's this way," he said stiffly, reaching for her trunk. Good God, the thing weighed a ton. What did she have in there? Rocks? Margaret picked up her carpet bag and followed him, her steps surprisingly graceful for a woman of her size. "It's a beautiful country," she said, looking out at the vast expanse of prairie. "Different from Chicago, but beautiful in its own way." "It's hard country," John replied, hefting her trunk into the wagon bed with a grunt. "Not for everyone." "Good thing I'm not everyone, then." She climbed up onto the wagon seat without waiting for his help, arranging her skirts with practiced efficiency. "How far to your ranch?" 3 hours, give or take. He climbed up beside her, careful to leave a respectable distance between them. "We'll stop at the church first. Reverend Mills is expecting us." Margaret turned to look at him fully then, and he saw something flicker in her eyes. Hurt, maybe, or disappointment. "Eager to get it done with, are you?" I assumed you'd want to get settled right away. Proper-like." "Oh, absolutely. Nothing improper about marrying a complete stranger an hour after meeting him." The sarcasm in her voice was sharp enough to cut leather. John felt heat rise in his cheeks. "You knew what this arrangement was, Miss O'Connor." The agency told me you were a widowed rancher looking for a wife. They said you were honest, hardworking, and Methodist. They showed me your photograph and your letters, which were brief but seemed genuine." She folded her hands in her lap, looking straight ahead now. "They didn't tell me you'd look at me like I was livestock you'd bought sight unseen and found wanting." The accusation stung, mostly because it was true. John snapped the reins and the horses started forward. "I apologize if I seemed... It's just been a long morning." "The train was late." 3 weeks late, actually. There was an incident with train robbers in Kansas. Didn't the agency wire you?" "No." He frowned. "You ran into trouble." "Nothing I couldn't handle." She said it matter-of-factly, but John noticed her hands tighten on her bag. "A bunch of boys playing at being desperados. They took one look at me and decided to rob the other car instead." Despite himself, John felt his lips twitch. "That's so. Apparently I don't look like I'd have anything worth stealing." She glanced at him sideways. "Disappointing men seems to be a talent of mine." They rode in silence for a while, the wagon wheels creaking rhythmically, the horses' hooves beating a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. The town fell away behind them, replaced by endless grassland that rippled like a golden sea in the wind. John found himself stealing glances at his bride-to-be, trying to reconcile the woman beside him with the image he'd built in his mind. She didn't fidget or fill the silence with nervous chatter like he'd expected. Instead, she watched the landscape with those sharp gray eyes, taking in every detail. When they passed a herd of pronghorn antelope, she smiled, a real smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to something close to beautiful. "Do you see them often?" she asked. "The antelope? They're common enough. Wait till you see your first buffalo herd. Not many left now, but sometimes a small group passes through." "I'd like that." She adjusted her bonnet against the sun. "Tell me about your ranch, Mr. McKenna. Your letters were rather economical with details." Economical. That was one way to put it. John had agonized over those letters, writing and rewriting them until they contained just the bare facts. "It's 640 acres. I run about 200 head of cattle, some horses. There's the main house, a barn, a bunkhouse for the hands." "How many hands?" "2 regular, Tom Patterson and Billy Chavez. Good men, both of them. They eat at the house morning and evening. So I'll be cooking for 4 men daily." "That's right. Can you... That is, the agency said you could cook." Margaret laughed, a rich, warm sound that seemed too big for the prairie to contain. "Mr. McKenna, I may not look like your typical delicate flower, but I assure you, I didn't get this way by not knowing my way around a kitchen. I've been cooking since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, as my mother used to say." "Your mother, is she still..." "Dead. 10 years now. Father, too." The cholera took them both. She said it simply, without asking for sympathy. "That's when I went into service." The Worthinghams in Chicago were good to me, but when their youngest came of age, they didn't need a governess anymore. And you decided to come west? I decided I was tired of raising other people's children while having none of my own. She turned to look at him directly. That is still part of the arrangement, isn't it? Children? John felt his face burn. Yes, ma'am. I mean, in time, when we're settled. How delicate you put it. That amused smile was back. Don't worry, Mr. McKenna. I'm not expecting you to fall madly in love with me at first sight. I know what this is, a business arrangement. You need a wife. I need a home. We're both adults. We can make this work without all the romantic nonsense. Romantic nonsense. Is that what Martha had been to him? No, but their love had grown slowly, carefully, like tending a garden. He'd been young then, still believing in possibilities. Now he just wanted someone to warm his bed and keep his house. Someone who wouldn't demand too much of his scarred heart. They were approaching the church, a simple white clapboard building that stood like a beacon against the endless sky. John could see Reverend Mill's buggy parked outside, which meant the old man was waiting for them. His stomach churned with something that felt uncomfortably like dread. There's something I should tell you, Margaret said suddenly. I'm not exactly what you'd call biddable. John pulled the horses to a stop. I'm sorry? Biddable, docile, obedient. Whatever word you want to use for a woman who does as she's told without question. She was looking at the church, not at him. I speak my mind, Mr. McKenna. I have opinions, and I share them. I work hard, I keep a clean house, and I'll be faithful to you till the day I die. But if you're expecting a mouse of a woman who'll disappear into the wallpaper, you'll be sorely disappointed. The agency said what you wanted to hear, just like they told me what I wanted to hear. She finally looked at him, and there was a vulnerability in her eyes that caught him off guard. So here's the question, Mr. McKenna. Do you want to turn this wagon around and take me back to the station? Because once we walk into that church, we're stuck with each other, for better or worse. John studied her face, this stranger who would be his wife within the hour. She was nothing like Martha, nothing like what he'd planned, but there was something about her, a strength, a practicality, that appealed to him despite himself. The ranch did need a woman's touch. He needed help, and she needed a home. It didn't have to be more complicated than that. We're here, he said finally. Might as well see it through. Margaret nodded, and if she was disappointed by his less than enthusiastic response, she didn't show it. Then let's get married, Mr. McKenna. Reverend Mills was indeed waiting, along with his wife Agnes, who would serve as witness. The Reverend was a small, bird-like man with wild white hair and kind eyes that had seen too much of human folly to be surprised by anything anymore. But even he did a double-take when he saw Margaret. Miss O'Connor, I presume? He recovered quickly, extending his hand. Welcome to Wyoming. I'm Reverend Mills, and this is my wife Agnes. Agnes Mills was eyeing Margaret like a cat eyes a particularly interesting mouse. John could already see the wheels turning in her head, imagining how she'd tell this story at the next church social. My dear, you must be exhausted from your journey. Such a long way from Chicago. It was an adventure, Margaret replied smoothly, shaking hands with both of them. But I'm glad to be here. Well then, Reverend Mills clapped his hands together. Shall we proceed? I have the documents ready in the vestry. The church was cool and dim inside, sunlight filtering through plain glass windows to cast geometric patterns on the wooden floor. It smelled of beeswax and old hymn books, a comfort John had almost forgotten. Martha had loved this church, had insisted on being married here even though her parents had wanted a fancy ceremony in Denver. Margaret stood beside him at the altar, solid and real in a way that Martha's memory never could be anymore. The Reverend began the ceremony, his voice rolling over the familiar words like water over stones. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. John found himself studying Margaret's profile as she listened to the Reverend. She had a strong jaw, determined chin. Her neck was thick but graceful, her shoulders broad but held with dignity. She'd removed her gloves, and he could see her hands were work-roughened, the nails short and practical. These were not the hands of a delicate lady, but of a woman who knew how to survive. Do you, John Samuel McKenna, Take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? The moment stretched like taffy. This was it, his last chance to back out, to send her back to Chicago and maintain his solitary existence. But winter was coming, and the ranch was falling apart, and he was so damn tired of being alone. I do. And do you, Margaret Mary O'Connor, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Margaret's voice was clear and strong. I do. The ring! John fumbled in his pocket for the simple gold band he'd bought months ago when he'd first written to the agency. It had been sized for a delicate finger, and for a horrible moment he thought it wouldn't fit. But Margaret calmly produced a small tin of lard from her bag. For my lips, she explained to Agnes's shocked expression, and with a little grease the ring slid on. I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride. It was the briefest of kisses, barely a brush of lips, but Margaret's mouth was softer than he'd expected, and she smelled of lavender and travel dust. When they pulled apart, her cheeks were pink, and for just a moment she looked young and uncertain. Then the moment passed, and she was shaking hands with the Reverend and his wife, signing the marriage certificate with a flourish, every inch the practical woman he'd married. They were back in the wagon before either spoke again. Well, Margaret said, that's done. Yes. John clicked his tongue at the horses. That's done. The rest of the journey to the ranch passed in relative quiet, broken only by John pointing out landmarks. The creek that marked his eastern boundary, the mesa where he'd lost 20 head to lightning 2 summers back, the stand of cottonwoods that meant they were almost home. Home. John felt a twist in his gut as they crested the final rise and the ranch buildings came into view. It wasn't much. A 2-story frame house that needed paint, a barn that listed slightly to the north, various outbuildings in various states of repair. But it was his, built with his own hands, and Martha's dreams. It's lovely, Margaret said, and she sounded like she meant it. It needs work. Everything worth having does. She was already surveying the property with a proprietary air. That garden plot, is it in use? Not for 2 years. We'll have to remedy that come spring, and those curtains in the front windows. Were Martha's. My late wife. He hadn't meant to say it so sharply, but the words came out edged with warning. Margaret studied him for a moment. I see. Well, we'll leave them be then. Tom and Billy were waiting by the barn, hats in hand, trying not to gawk. Tom was the older of the two, a grizzled cowhand who'd been with John since the beginning. Billy was just 18, a Mexican boy with a quick smile and a way with horses. Both were staring at Margaret like she was some kind of exotic creature. Boys, this is Mrs. McKenna, John said, helping Margaret down from the wagon. Margaret, this is Tom Patterson and Billy Chavez. Ma'am. Tom nodded, his weathered face carefully neutral. Welcome to the Double Bar K. Senora. Billy's smile was genuine. It's good to have a woman on the ranch again. Thank you both. Margaret smiled warmly at them. I hope you're hungry. I plan to have supper on the table by 6, and I don't believe in small portions. Billy's grin widened. Yes, ma'am. The house felt strange with Margaret in it, like a familiar song played in a different key. She moved through the rooms with business-like efficiency, taking stock of what was there and what was needed. The kitchen, she proclaimed, was adequate but needed organizing. The parlor was dusty but salvageable. She didn't comment on the layer of grime that covered everything, or the mouse droppings in the pantry, or the fact that the stove hadn't been properly cleaned in months. Which room is mine? She asked finally. John felt his face heat. Our room. Upstairs at the end of the hall. She nodded, picking up her carpet bag. I'll need help with my trunk. He followed her up the narrow stairs, the trunk balanced on his shoulder, trying not to notice the way her hips swayed with each step. The bedroom door stuck, as it always did in autumn when the wood swelled with moisture. John had to shoulder it open, nearly dropping the trunk in the process. The room was exactly as Martha had left it, down to the embroidered pillows on the bed and the silver brush set on the dresser. Margaret stood in the doorway, taking it all in, her expression unreadable. She was beautiful, she said finally, looking at the photograph on the nightstand. Martha, in her wedding dress, slim and ethereal as a fairy tale princess. Yes. John set the trunk down with a thump. She was. I'll try not to disturb things too much. Margaret moved to the window, looking out at the view of the prairie. But I will need some space for my things. Of course. She turned to face him, and in the afternoon light streaming through the window, he could see the exhaustion she'd been hiding. I know this is awkward, Mr. McKenna. For both of us. But we're married now, and I intend to be a good wife to you. I'll cook your meals and clean your house and warm your bed, and in time, God willing, I'll give you children. But I need you to understand something. I won't compete with a ghost. I won't try to be her, and I won't apologize for not being her. I'm Margaret, and that will have to be enough. John didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Supper's at 6, you said? 6 sharp. He left her to unpack, fleeing to the barn where things made sense. Tom was waiting for him, tobacco tucked in his cheek, eyes twinkling with suppressed mirth. That's a lot of woman you married, boss. Shut up, Tom. I'm just saying, she looks like she could pull a plow herself if needed. I said shut up. Tom spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Martha was a sweet little thing, God rest her soul. But sweet don't always survive out here. Maybe you got what you need, even if it ain't what you wanted. John grabbed a pitchfork and attacked the hay with unnecessary violence. I don't recall asking for your opinion. No, sir, you surely didn't. Tom tipped his hat and sauntered off, whistling. By the time John returned to the house, the kitchen was transformed. The windows were clean, the floor swept, and something that smelled like heaven was bubbling on the stove. Margaret had changed into a simple work dress and apron, her hair still up but with tendrils escaping to frame her flushed face. Beef stew, she announced, with biscuits. I found some preserved vegetables in the cellar that were still good. Tomorrow I'll need to go to town for proper supplies. There's credit at Morrison's General Store. Good. This pantry is a disgrace. She was kneading biscuit dough with practiced efficiency, her strong arms working the mixture. How long have you been batching it? 2 years. It shows. But she said it with a smile that took the sting out. Go wash up. Supper's almost ready. The meal was a revelation. John had forgotten what real food tasted like, not the burned beans and tough meat he and the boys had been subsisting on. The stew was rich and flavorful, the biscuits light as clouds. Even Tom, not given to compliments, allowed as how it was mighty fine eating. Margaret presided over the table like she'd been doing it all her life, keeping the conversation flowing, asking Tom and Billy about their work, their families, their plans. She laughed at Billy's stories about his younger sisters, sympathized with Tom's complaints about his rheumatism. By the end of the meal, both men were looking at her with something approaching awe. That was wonderful, ma'am, Billy said, pushing back from the table with a satisfied sigh. Best meal I've had in years. Flatterer. But Margaret looked pleased. There's apple cake for dessert, if you've got room. There was always room for apple cake, apparently. John watched his hands devour the sweet, moist cake with sounds that bordered on obscene. When had he last had dessert? Martha had been too delicate for much cooking, especially toward the end when the consumption took hold. After the hands left for the bunkhouse, Margaret began clearing the table. John stood to help, but she waved him off. Sit. You've been working all day. So have you. You just got off a train, and sitting makes me restless. She poured hot water from the kettle into the wash basin. Tell me about the ranch. The real story, not the version you'd tell a stranger. So he did. As she washed and he dried, she'd insisted, he found himself talking more than he had in months, about the drought last summer that had nearly wiped him out, about the mortgage payment coming due in spring, about his plans to buy the adjacent property if he could scrape together the money, about everything except Martha. You love this place, Margaret observed, scrubbing a pot with more force than strictly necessary. It's all I have. No. She turned to look at him, suds up to her elbows. It's all you've allowed yourself to have. There's a difference. Before he could respond, she'd turned back to her washing. What time do you rise? 5, usually. Then I'll have breakfast ready by 5:30. Eggs, bacon, biscuits, coffee. Will that suit? You don't have to. Yes, I do. It's what wives do, Mr. McKenna, even mail-order ones who don't match their descriptions. There was a bite to her words that made him flinch. About that, no. She pulled the stopper from the drain, watching the dirty water swirl away. We don't need to discuss it. We're both stuck with what we got. Might as well make the best of it. The evening stretched awkwardly after that. Margaret found some mending to do, sitting in Martha's rocking chair by the fire, her needle flashing in the lamplight. John tried to read his almanac, but found himself watching her instead. She had a way of humming under her breath, some Irish tune he didn't recognize. Her fingers were quick and sure, turning his worn work shirts into something respectable again. Finally, the clock struck 9, and Margaret set aside her mending. I think I'll retire. John's mouth went dry. I'll be up shortly. She nodded and climbed the stairs, her footsteps heavy but measured. John waited a full half hour, nursing a whiskey he didn't really want, before following. She was already in bed when he entered, the covers pulled up to her chin, her hair braided for sleep. She'd blown out all the lamps but one, leaving the room in soft shadows. John undressed quickly, conscious of her presence, and slid into bed beside her. The bed, which had always seemed more than adequate, suddenly felt very small. Margaret took up a considerable portion of it, her warmth radiating across the space between them. The mattress dipped toward her weight, and John had to brace himself to keep from rolling into her. "Good night, Mr. McKenna," she said softly. "John," he said. "You should call me John." "Good night, John." They lay in silence, two strangers in a marriage bed, listening to the wind rattle the windows. John could hear her breathing, feel the subtle movement as she shifted, trying to get comfortable. The bed frame creaked ominously. "We don't have to," he started, then stopped, unsure how to finish. "I know." Her voice was barely a whisper. "You're not ready." "Neither am I. We have time. But time for what? To fall in love, to learn to tolerate each other, to produce the children that would make this arrangement worthwhile?" John stared at the ceiling, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Beside him, Margaret's breathing deepened into sleep. She snored. Not loudly, but distinctly. Martha had never snored. Martha had barely seemed to breathe at all, especially near the end, each breath a struggle, a whisper against death. Margaret was nothing like Martha. She was loud and large and alive in a way that filled the house, pushed against its boundaries. She was too much, too present, too real. But as John finally drifted towards sleep, he had to admit the house already felt warmer with her in it. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The town gossips would have a field day, and he'd have to endure the jokes and pitying looks from his neighbors. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, he wasn't alone in this bed, in this house, in this life he'd built on the prairie. Margaret shifted in her sleep, the bed groaning under her movement, and rolled toward him. One heavy arm flopped across his chest, and John froze, unsure whether to move it or leave it be. In the end, exhaustion won, and he left it there, this unexpected weight anchoring him to the present. Outside, a coyote howled at the moon, and the wind sang its eternal song across the grassland. Inside, two strangers began the slow, uncertain dance of becoming something more, though neither could guess what that something might be. The morning would come soon enough, bringing with it the harsh light of reality and all the challenges of forcing two lives into one. But for now, in the darkness, with Margaret's warmth beside him and her soft snores filling the silence, John allowed himself a moment of something that wasn't quite hope, but wasn't despair either. It was perhaps possibility. The rooster's crow came too early, as it always did, but this morning John woke to the smell of coffee and bacon already filling the house. For a moment, disoriented, he thought Martha had recovered, that the past 2 years had been some terrible dream. Then he felt the deep indentation in the mattress beside him, still warm from Margaret's body, and reality crashed back. She was already in the kitchen when he came downstairs, moving between stove and table with practiced efficiency. Her hair was pinned up tight, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms that could probably arm wrestle most men to shame. She'd found one of Martha's aprons, which barely covered half her front and looked almost comical, stretched across her ample bosom. "Morning," she said without turning around. "Coffee's ready. Food will be on the table in 5 minutes." John poured himself a cup, the coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, just how he liked it. Through the window, he could see Tom and Billy making their way from the bunkhouse, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. October in Wyoming meant frost on the grass and ice in the water troughs. "Sleep well?" Margaret asked, sliding a plate in front of him laden with more food than he usually ate in an entire day. Well enough. He hadn't really. Every time Margaret had shifted in the night, the bed had creaked like a ship in a storm. Around 3 in the morning, he'd given up and moved to the floor, though he'd crept back before dawn to avoid questions. Tom and Billy entered, bringing with them the smell of horses and hay. Both men's eyes widened at the spread on the table. "Morning, Mrs. McKenna," Tom said, hat in hand. "That surely smells fine. Sit, both of you, before it gets cold." Margaret was already pouring their coffee. "Billy, you're too skinny. Take more bacon." "Yes, ma'am." Billy grinned, helping himself to enough bacon to feed a small army. The meal passed in relative quiet, the men too busy eating to talk much. Margaret had made enough food for 8 people, and John watched with amazement as most of it disappeared. Even he found himself taking seconds, then thirds of the light, fluffy biscuits she'd somehow produced before dawn. "I need to go to town today," Margaret announced as she cleared the plates. "The pantry situation is dire, and I need proper supplies if I'm to feed you all through winter." John nodded. "I'll drive you." "No need. I can manage a wagon myself." Tom choked on his coffee. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but town can be a bit rough, especially on Saturdays when the cowboys come in." "I've dealt with rough men before, Mr. Patterson." Margaret's smile had an edge to it. "But I appreciate the concern." John stood. "I'm driving you." "That's final." Margaret's eyes flashed, and for a moment he thought she'd argue. Then she nodded. "As you wish." "We leave in an hour?" The ride to town was tense. Margaret sat rigid beside him, her jaw set in a way that reminded him of a bull about to charge. She'd changed into her best dress, a dark blue wool that emphasized rather than disguised her size. With her bonnet tied firmly under her chin and her gloves properly buttoned, she looked every inch the respectable matron, if one ignored the fact that she took up more than half the wagon seat. "You don't trust me to handle myself," she said finally, as the town came into view. "It's not about trust. It's about appearances. You're my wife now. That comes with certain expectations." "Such as?" "Such as not gallivanting around town alone your first week here. People talk. People will talk anyway." She gestured to herself with a bitter laugh. "Look at me, John. Do you really think people aren't already talking? Did you see what came off the train for John McKenna? Poor man, ordering a bride sight unseen and getting this." John pulled the horses to a stop right there in the middle of the road. "Is that what you think? That you're some kind of disappointment to be ashamed of?" "Aren't I?" Her voice was quiet now, vulnerable. "You couldn't even look at me at the station. You looked like someone had played a cruel joke on you." He wanted to deny it, but they'd promised honesty, hadn't they? "You weren't what I expected," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean—" "Margaret, you cooked the best meal I've had in years. You've already got Tom and Billy eating out of your hand. The house feels alive again. That's not nothing." "But it's not enough either, is it?" She turned to look at him fully. "You wanted a ghost, John. Someone who could slip into Martha's place without disturbing anything. I can't be that." "I know." "Do you?" "Because that bedroom is still a shrine to her. Her clothes are still in the wardrobe. Her brush still has her hair in it. How am I supposed to be your wife when you're still married to a memory?" Before John could answer, a voice called out from the side of the road. "John McKenna, is that you?" Mayor Randolph Garrett approached on foot, his substantial belly preceding him, accompanied by his wife Constance, a narrow woman who looked like she'd been sucking lemons since birth. Both were staring at Margaret with undisguised curiosity. "Mayor, Mrs. Garrett." John climbed down to shake hands, acutely aware of Margaret's weight making the wagon list to one side. "May I present my wife, Margaret?" "Your wife?" Constance's voice rose to a pitch that could shatter glass. "Why, John, we had no idea you were courting anyone." Margaret descended from the wagon with surprising grace, extending her hand. "Pleased to meet you. John and I were married yesterday." "Yesterday?" Constance looked like she might faint. But, but where did you, that is, how did you meet? Through correspondence, Margaret said smoothly. I was in Chicago, looking for a change of scenery. John was looking for a wife. It seemed a practical arrangement. The mayor coughed. Practical. Yes. Well, welcome to Cheyenne, Mrs. McKenna. I'm sure you'll find it quite different from Chicago. I'm adaptable. Margaret's smile could have frozen water. Now, if you'll excuse us, I need to see about supplies. This winter won't provision itself. She swept past them toward Morrison's general store, leaving John to follow in her wake. He could hear Constance's whispered, "Did you see the size of her?" Before they were even out of earshot. Morrison's was busy for a Saturday morning, ranchers' wives picking over fabric, cowboys lounging by the stove, old men playing checkers in the corner. Every conversation stopped when Margaret entered. Harold Morrison, the proprietor, recovered first. "John, heard you had a visitor from Chicago. This must be her." "My wife, Margaret." "Margaret, Harold Morrison." "Ma'am." Harold's eyes kept drifting to Margaret's impressive bosom, then snapping back to her face. "What can I do for you today?" Margaret pulled out a list that seemed to go on forever. "Let's start with flour. 100 pounds, 50 pounds of sugar, 25 of salt, 10 of baking soda." As she rattled off her requirements, John noticed the other women in the store clustering together, whispering behind their hands. One of them, Sally Jenkins, whose husband owned the neighboring ranch, approached with a false smile. "You must be John's new bride. We heard he was expecting someone from back east." "News travels fast," Margaret observed, examining a bolt of calico. "Well, it's such a surprise. John never mentioned he was corresponding with anyone. After poor dear Martha passed, we all assumed he'd stay a bachelor. Life has a way of surprising us all, doesn't it?" Margaret moved on to examine the canned goods. "Mr. Morrison, these prices seem rather high." Harold shifted uncomfortably. "Well, shipping costs, you understand." "I understand perfectly." Margaret's voice could have cut steel. "In Chicago, we'd call it gouging, but perhaps that's just the Wyoming way of welcoming newcomers." The store went silent. Harold's face turned red. "Now see here, 5% discount on the whole order," Margaret interrupted, "as a wedding gift." "That seems fair, doesn't it?" John wanted to sink through the floor. Martha would never have haggled, would never have made a scene. But Harold, after a long moment, nodded. 5%. As a wedding gift. How generous. Margaret smiled sweetly and continued shopping. By the time they left, the wagon was loaded with enough supplies to survive a siege, and every person in town had gotten an eyeful of John McKenna's substantial new bride. Margaret sat beside him in silence as they drove out of town, but he could feel her trembling. "You did well," he said finally. "I embarrassed you." "No." "Well, maybe a little. But Morrison has been overcharging everyone for years. Nobody's ever had the guts to call him on it. Your Martha would never have done that." "No," John agreed. "She wouldn't have." They rode in silence for a while, the wagon creaking under its load. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Those women were horrible." "They're not all bad. They just... Martha was well liked. She was one of them. You're an outsider." "I'm fat." The word hung in the air like a challenge. "Let's not dance around it, John." "I'm fat, and I'm loud, and I don't know my place. That's what they see." John didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. But as they approached the ranch, he found himself thinking about the way she'd stood up to Harold Morrison, the way she'd faced down those gossiping women with her chin high. Martha would have crumbled under that scrutiny. She'd needed protecting, constant shielding from the harsh realities of frontier life. Margaret seemed to meet those realities head-on and dare them to do their worst. That evening, after another magnificent supper that had Tom and Billy groaning with satisfaction, John found Margaret in the garden plot, pulling weeds by lamplight. "It's too late in the season to plant anything," he said. "I'm preparing for spring." She yanked a particularly stubborn weed with enough force to send dirt flying. "This soil's been neglected, but it's good earth underneath. Just needs some attention." "Like everything else around here." She looked up at him, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "Are we still talking about the garden?" I cleared out half the wardrobe, he said abruptly, and the dresser. For your things. Margaret stood slowly, brushing dirt from her skirts. Thank you. I'm not ready to put everything away. Not yet. I'm not asking you to. She moved closer, and he could smell the earth on her, mixed with lavender soap. But I need some space to exist, John. I can't live in this house like a ghost myself. I know. He looked at her hands, seeing the dirt under her nails, the calluses on her palms. Working hands. Living hands. It's harder than I thought it would be, having someone else here. I imagine it is. She started to reach for him, then stopped. We're strangers, you and I, strangers playing at being married. But we don't have to stay strangers. That night, as they prepared for bed, the awkwardness was palpable. Margaret had rearranged some of the furniture to accommodate her trunk, and her brush and mirror now sat beside Martha's on the dresser. It was a small change, but it made the room feel different, less like a memorial and more like a space where people actually lived. I'll try not to snore tonight, Margaret said as she climbed into bed. The frame groaned alarmingly. It's fine. John slid in beside her, trying to ignore the way the mattress tilted. I've slept through worse. Liar. But she was smiling. They lay there in the dark, both clinging to their respective edges of the bed, the space between them feeling like a chasm. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds scratching against the house. Tell me about her, Margaret said suddenly. Martha, tell me what she was like. John was quiet for so long that Margaret probably thought he wouldn't answer. She was small, he finally said. Delicate. Like those china dolls in Morrison's store window. She had golden hair that caught the sun, and the smallest hands I'd ever seen. When she laughed, it was like bells ringing. You loved her very much. I did. I do. He stared at the ceiling. She wasn't made for this life, though. The frontier was too harsh for her. The winters too cold, the summers too hot, the work too hard. She tried, God knows she tried, but it wore her down. Then the consumption came, and she just faded away. Margaret was quiet for a moment. My mother was like that. Delicate. Beautiful. She married my father thinking love would be enough, but love doesn't put food on the table or keep the cold out. After she died, my father remarried. A sturdy German woman named Greta who could kill a chicken with her bare hands and bake bread that could feed an army. Did you resent her? At first, she wasn't my mother. She was loud and took up too much space and didn't care about poetry or pretty things. But she kept us fed and warm and safe, and in her own way, she loved us fiercely. Margaret shifted, making the bed creak. Sometimes I wonder if my father loved her, or if he just needed her. Maybe there wasn't a difference. John thought about that. Is that what you think this is? Need disguised as marriage? Isn't it? She turned to face him, though he could barely see her in the darkness. You needed a wife to run your house. I needed a home. We're using each other, John. The only question is whether we can find something more than that. And if we can't, then we'll have a clean house and full bellies and maybe some children to carry on your name. There are worse fates. She was right, of course. He'd known couples who'd built entire lives on less, but lying there beside her, feeling her warmth and solidity, smelling the lavender in her hair, John found himself wanting something more than just practicality. Not love, perhaps. He'd used up his allocation of that with Martha, but something. Companionship, maybe. Partnership. A reason to come home that wasn't just habit. Your feet are cold, Margaret observed. Sorry. He started to pull them away, but she trapped them between her calves. It's fine. I run hot. Greta used to say I was like a furnace. She yawned. We should sleep. Tomorrow's Sunday. I assume you go to church? Usually. Then I'll need to press my good dress, face all those horrified women again. You don't have to go. Of course I do. I'm your wife. We'll face them together. Together. Such a simple word, but John hadn't been together with anyone in so long. Even at the end with Martha, she'd been so far away, lost in her own failing body, that he'd felt alone even holding her hand. Margaret? Thank you. For the meals, for standing up to Morrison, for trying. She was quiet for so long he thought she'd fallen asleep. Then, softly, "You're welcome, John." The next morning dawned bright and cold, frost painting the windows in delicate patterns. Margaret was up before him again, this time in her good dress, her hair pinned in an elaborate style that must have taken considerable effort. She'd made a breakfast feast again, but there was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. "You're nervous," John observed. "I'm about to walk into a church full of people who think I'm a joke at best and a gold digger at worst. Yes, I'm nervous. You're my wife. That's all that matters." She gave him a look that suggested that was far from all that mattered, but she didn't argue. The church was packed when they arrived, every neck craning to get a look at the new Mrs. McKenna. Margaret walked in with her head high, her hand on John's arm, looking neither left nor right, but John could feel her trembling slightly. They took what had always been his pew, third from the front on the left. The wood creaked ominously as Margaret settled herself, and John saw several people exchange glances. Behind them, he could hear whispered conversations starting already. Reverend Mills delivered a sermon on judgment and Christian charity that seemed pointedly directed at certain members of the congregation. Margaret sat through it all with perfect composure, her hands folded in her lap, her attention apparently focused entirely on the Reverend. After the service, as people filed out, Sally Jenkins approached again, this time with several other ranchers' wives in tow. "Margaret, dear, we're having a quilting bee Thursday afternoon. You simply must come. It was a trap, and everyone knew it. These quilting bees were where the women dissected everyone's business, where alliances were formed and reputations destroyed. Martha had hated them, but had gone anyway, coming home in tears more often than not." "How kind," Margaret said. "What time?" 2:00, at my home. You know where it is, don't you, John?" "Yes." "Wonderful. We're so eager to get to know you better, Margaret." As they walked to the wagon, Margaret muttered, "They're going to eat me alive." "You don't have to go." "Yes, I do. If I don't, they'll talk about me anyway, and I won't be there to defend myself." She let him help her up into the wagon. "Besides, I can outquilt any of those harpies." Greta made sure of that. The week passed in a blur of domesticity. Margaret attacked the house like a general conducting a campaign, scrubbing and organizing with frightening efficiency. She had Tom and Billy eating out of her hand, even convincing them to help her repair the chicken coop in exchange for extra pie. The house began to smell of baking bread and simmering stews instead of dust and loneliness. But the nights remained awkward. They circled each other in the bedroom like wary cats, careful not to touch more than necessary. The bed continued its protests every time either of them moved, and John had taken to wedging a piece of wood under the corner that seemed most likely to collapse. Thursday arrived too quickly. Margaret dressed carefully, choosing a burgundy dress that Martha had never worn, one of the few things that hadn't been touched in 2 years. It fit her surprisingly well, though the seams strained slightly across her chest. "How do I look?" she asked John. "Fine," he said, then seeing her face fall, added, "Beautiful. You look beautiful." She laughed, but it was bitter. "Liar. But thank you for trying." The Jenkins Ranch was larger than the Double Bar K, more prosperous, with a 2-story house that had actual glass windows and a wraparound porch. Several buggies were already parked outside when John drove up. 2 hours, Margaret said. "If I'm not out by then, come in with guns blazing." "Margaret, I'm joking." She squeezed his hand briefly. "Mostly." John watched her walk into that house like she was walking into a den of wolves, and he felt something twist in his chest that might have been admiration or might have been something else entirely. He went to the saloon to wait, nursing a single whiskey for 2 hours while pretending not to hear the speculation about his new wife from the other patrons. The consensus seemed to be that he'd been swindled, though a few suggested that a woman built like that would at least keep him warm through the winter. When he returned to the Jenkins house, he could hear laughter from inside. Not the polite tittering of ladies, but real, full-bodied laughter. He knocked, and Sally Jenkins herself answered, her face flushed and her usually perfect hair slightly mussed. "John, come in, come in. Your wife has been regaling us with stories from Chicago. Did you know she once chased off a burglar with nothing but a rolling pin?" The parlor was in chaos. The quilting frame had been pushed aside, and the women were clustered around Margaret, who was demonstrating something with her hands that had them all in stitches. Even Constance Garrett was smiling, though she looked somewhat confused by the turn of events. "John!" Margaret's face lit up when she saw him. Perfect timing. "I was just showing the ladies that trick I learned for getting wine stains out of silk." "My grandmother's tablecloth," Emily Morrison breathed. "You saved my grandmother's tablecloth." I thought it was ruined forever. As they drove home, John couldn't contain his curiosity. "What happened in there?" Margaret grinned. "Sally Jenkins made the mistake of criticizing my quilting technique, so I showed her how we did it in Chicago. Then Emily spilled wine on that tablecloth she was embroidering and nearly cried, so I helped her fix it. One thing led to another, and before you know it, I was teaching them how to make proper Irish soda bread. You won them over. I wouldn't go that far. But I showed them I'm not just some fortune hunter who tricked you into marriage." Her smile faded. "Though I suppose that's what I am, isn't it? I came here for a home, for security." "That makes me a fortune hunter of sorts. You came here for a life," John corrected. "Same as anyone who comes west. That's not fortune hunting, that's survival." That night, as they prepared for bed, Margaret seemed lighter somehow, less careful in her movements. She hummed as she brushed her hair, the silver brush Martha had never used catching the lamplight. "Those women," she said, "they're not so different from the society ladies in Chicago. They just want to feel important, to know things others don't. Once I gave them that, they softened." Martha never figured that out. Martha didn't need to. She was one of them from the start. Margaret set down the brush. "I'll never be one of them, John. But I can coexist with them." As she climbed into bed, the frame gave an alarming crack. Both of them froze. "Maybe we should," John started, but never got to finish. With a sound like a gunshot, the bed frame split completely, the mattress dropping to the floor with a tremendous thud. Margaret tumbled backward, her legs in the air, nightgown tangled around her knees. John fell forward, landing partially on top of her in a tangle of limbs and bedding. For a moment, they just stared at each other in shock. Then Margaret started to laugh, not a delicate giggle, but a full-throated guffaw that shook her entire body. "Well," she gasped, "I suppose that's one way to bring us closer together." John found himself laughing too, the absurdity of the situation overwhelming any embarrassment. Here they were, two grown adults sprawled on a broken bed like children who'd jumped on it too hard. "Are you hurt?" he managed to ask. "Only my dignity, and that was already questionable." She was still laughing, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, John, the look on your face." "We broke the bed," he said, somewhat unnecessarily. "We certainly did. Though technically, I think I broke the bed. You're just an innocent bystander." They were still tangled together, her warmth seeping through the thin fabric of their night clothes. John became suddenly, acutely aware of her body beneath him, soft and yielding and unexpectedly appealing. Their eyes met, and the laughter died. "John?" Her voice was uncertain now. He kissed her. Not the brief, dutiful peck of their wedding day, but a real kiss, deep and searching. She made a small sound of surprise, then her arms came around him, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Well," Margaret said softly, "that was unexpected. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. If you apologize for kissing me, John McKenna, I swear I'll brain you with what's left of this bed frame." He laughed again, rolling off her and onto his back on the ruined mattress. "What are we going to do about the bed?" "Sleep on the floor, I suppose. Or ... quote. She hesitated. "There's the guest room." The bed in there looked sturdy enough. The guest room. Martha had decorated it for the children they'd never had, with cheerful yellow walls and white curtains. John hadn't been in there since she died. "All right," he said, surprising himself. "The guest room." They gathered their pillows and blankets, Margaret leading the way down the hall. The guest room was dusty, but intact, the bed frame solid oak that looked like it could withstand a cavalry charge. As they remade the bed, working in comfortable tandem, John found himself stealing glances at his wife. She was nothing like what he'd wanted, nothing like what he'd expected, but standing there in her nightgown, her hair coming loose from its braid, a pillow clutched to her chest, She was absolutely perfect in her imperfection. "What?" she asked, catching him staring. "Nothing. Just, you're not what I ordered." "No," she agreed. "I'm not." "Are you sending me back?" He thought about it, really thought about it. About the empty house filling with laughter. About Tom and Billy's faces at every meal. About the way she'd stood up to Morrison, to the church ladies, to everything this harsh land threw at her. "No," he said. "I think I'll keep you." "Good," she said, throwing a pillow at his head. "Because I'm not going anywhere." They settled into the guest room bed with careful movements, both aware that something had shifted between them with that kiss on the broken bed frame. Margaret lay on her side, facing away from him, but John could feel the warmth radiating from her body across the small space between them. The new bed held firm beneath their combined weight, its oak frame solid as the mountains that ringed the valley. "Can't sleep," Margaret whispered into the darkness an hour later. "No," John admitted. "You?" "My mind won't quiet." She rolled over to face him, her features barely visible in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. That kiss changed things. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. "John, I need to tell you something about why I really came west." He waited, sensing this was important. "There was a man in Chicago, my employer's brother. He pursued me, wouldn't take no for an answer. When I continued to refuse him, he told his sister I'd been stealing. They dismissed me without reference." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the pain beneath it. "No one would hire me after that. A governess who steals? I was ruined. The matrimonial agency was my only option." John felt anger rise in his chest, hot and unexpected. "He destroyed your life because I wouldn't be his mistress. A fat Irish girl should have been grateful for his attention, you see." The bitterness in her voice could have curdled milk. "So yes, John, I'm a fortune hunter. I came here running from scandal, desperate for any man who would have me." "You're not a fortune hunter," John said firmly. "You're a survivor." "There's a difference." She reached out tentatively, her fingers finding his in the darkness. "Martha didn't have to be a survivor, did she? She was loved and protected all her life." "Until the consumption came. Then all my love and protection meant nothing." He squeezed her fingers. "Maybe that's why. Maybe I wanted someone delicate again because I thought I could do better this time. Protect her better." "But you don't need protecting, do you?" "Everyone needs protecting sometimes, John. I just hide it better than most." The next morning brought the first real storm of the season, the wind howling like a living thing, driving rain against the windows hard enough to rattle the glass. John and the hands worked frantically to secure the livestock, driving the cattle into the nearest pasture, checking the barn for loose boards that might tear away. Margaret had breakfast waiting when they stumbled in, soaked and shivering. She pressed hot coffee into their hands, threw blankets around their shoulders, and had dry clothes warming by the fire before John could even ask. "Storm's going to be a bad one," Tom said, water still dripping from his mustache. "Saw lightning strike out by Devil's Ridge. Could start a fire if this rain lets up." "We'll need to watch for it," John agreed, already mentally calculating what they could afford to lose if fire came. The answer was nothing. They couldn't afford to lose anything. The storm raged for 3 days. The men took turns watching for fires, for spooked cattle, for anything that might spell disaster. Margaret kept them fed, kept coffee brewing constantly, and somehow managed to patch Billy's coat when he tore it on barbed wire, all while the house shook around them like it might blow away entirely. On the third night, with the wind screaming like demons and rain coming down in sheets, John found her standing at the kitchen window, staring out into the darkness. "What do you see?" he asked. "Nothing." "Everything." She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. In Chicago, storms meant staying indoors, maybe lighting an extra lamp. Here, it feels like the world might end. "It might," he said honestly. "That's the frontier. Everything's trying to kill you, the weather, the land, sometimes the people. But you stay. We stay." He moved to stand beside her. Martha hated storms. She'd hide in the bedroom with pillows over her ears, crying until it passed. I'm not afraid of storms, Margaret said. I'm afraid of what comes after. The damage you can't fix, the losses you can't recover from. As if in response to her words, there was a tremendous crash from outside. John grabbed his coat and lantern, Margaret right behind him despite his protests. They found the chicken coop demolished, blown apart like matchsticks. The chickens were scattered, some dead, others huddled miserably under whatever shelter they could find. "My chickens!" Margaret wailed, then immediately began gathering the survivors, cooing to them softly as she tucked them inside her coat. "Help me, John. We can put them in the barn for now." They worked together in the driving rain, Margaret somehow managing to locate every surviving bird through some maternal instinct John couldn't fathom. By the time they'd secured the chickens in the barn, both were soaked through and muddy to their knees. "You're shivering," John observed as they stumbled back to the house. "I'm fine," but her teeth were chattering. "You're not fine. You'll catch your death." He steered her toward their bedroom, the guest room that had become theirs, and began pulling dry clothes from the wardrobe. Change. Now. So, bossy. But she was already working at the buttons of her dress with numb fingers. John turned his back, giving her privacy, though after 3 weeks of marriage, the gesture seemed almost quaint. He changed his own clothes quickly, then built up the fire in the bedroom fireplace until it roared. "Better?" he asked, turning to find her wrapped in 2 quilts, still shivering. Getting there. She patted the bed beside her. "You're cold, too. Come here." He hesitated for just a moment before joining her under the quilts. She immediately pressed against him, her body still radiating cold despite the blankets. "This is purely medicinal," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "Body heat and all that." "Purely medicinal," he agreed, wrapping his arms around her. They stayed like that as the storm continued its assault on the house. Her gradually warming, him gradually realizing that holding her felt right. Not like holding Martha, who had been all sharp angles and fragility. Margaret was soft curves and solid presence, someone who could weather a storm beside him rather than hide from it. 20 chickens, she murmured sleepily. "We lost 20 chickens. We'll get more come spring." "With what money?" It was a fair question. The ranch was barely scraping by as it was. The mortgage payment loomed in 6 months, and if they couldn't make it, "We'll figure it out," he said, though he had no idea how. The storm finally broke the next morning, leaving behind a world washed clean and damaged in equal measure. Besides the chicken coop, they'd lost part of the barn roof and several fence posts. The garden Margaret had been preparing was now a muddy lake, but there was no time to dwell on losses. The real disaster came with Tom's shout from the north pasture. "Boss, we got trouble!" John and Margaret both ran toward his voice, finding Tom standing over a dead steer, its body bloated and discolored. "Anthrax," Tom said grimly. "Seen it before. We need to burn this carcass now and check every other head." Anthrax. The word hit John like a physical blow. If it spread through the herd, they'd lose everything. The ranch, the land, any chance of a future. "How many?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Just this one so far, but—" Tom shook his head. "You know how it goes." They spent the next week in a nightmare of checking cattle, burning carcasses, and praying. 7 more steers died, each one representing months of profit gone up in smoke. Margaret worked alongside them, her skirts tied up, her hands blistered from handling tools she'd never used before. "You don't have to do this," John told her as she helped him drag another carcass to the burn pile. "Yes, I do." Her face was streaked with soot and sweat. "For better or worse, remember?" This is the worst part. By the time the disease had run its course, they'd lost 12 head total. Not catastrophic, but combined with the storm damage and the lost chickens, it might as well have been a death blow. John sat at the kitchen table that night, staring at his ledger, the numbers swimming before his eyes. No matter how he calculated it, they didn't have enough to make the mortgage payment and survive the winter. "How bad?" Margaret asked, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. "Bad." He showed her the numbers. "We're about $300 short, and that's if nothing else goes wrong between now and spring." She studied the ledger with those sharp gray eyes. What about selling some horses? Need them all for the spring roundup. Can't work cattle without horses. The hands? Can't let them go. 2 men is already running lean. He rubbed his face. I could try to get another loan, but the bank's already carrying more paper on this place than it's worth. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood and went to their bedroom, returning with her trunk. From a hidden compartment in the bottom, she pulled out a small cloth bag. Here. She set it on the table. John opened it to find a roll of bills and some gold coins. Margaret, what? $340. My savings from 10 years of being a governess. She sat back down, her hands folded in her lap. It's yours. I can't take your money. Our money. I'm your wife, John. Your debts are my debts. Your ranch is my home. She reached across the table to take his hand. Besides, what else am I going to do with it? Buy a ticket back to Chicago and the scandal waiting for me there. This might just be delaying the inevitable. If next year's is bad, then we'll face next year when it comes. But this money buys us time. Time to rebuild the chicken coop, fix the barn, maybe even expand the garden come spring. Time for cattle prices to improve. Time for us to... She paused, color rising in her cheeks. Time for us to figure out what we are to each other. John looked at the money, then at his wife. His practical, sturdy, unexpected wife who had just saved them with her carefully hoarded freedom fund. Margaret, Don't thank me. Just promise me something. What? Promise me that you'll stop comparing me to her. Stop waiting for me to be something I'm not. I'm here, John. I'm real, and I'm flawed, and I'm trying. Can that be enough? He stood, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. It's more than enough, he said, and kissed her properly, the way he should have been kissing her all along. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Margaret smiled. Well then, should we go practice making those children you mentioned wanting? Seems like we should get started if we're going to have help running this ranch someday. John laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. Practical as always. Someone has to be. But she was laughing too as he led her to their bedroom. The next few weeks brought a shift in the household. With the immediate crisis past, thanks to Margaret's money, they could focus on repairs and preparations for winter. But more than that, there was a warmth between John and Margaret now that had nothing to do with sharing body heat for survival. Tom noticed it first. You're smiling, he observed one morning as John came whistling into the barn. Am I not allowed to smile? Haven't seen you do it much in 2 years. That woman's good for you. She is, John agreed, surprising himself with how easily the admission came. Margaret had taken to ranch life with a determination that both amazed and amused him. She insisted on learning to ride, though the sight of her mounting a horse was something that had Billy hiding his laughter behind his hand. She learned to milk the cow they'd bought to replace some of the chickens, though the cow seemed as skeptical of her as she was of it. She even attempted to help with branding, though that experiment ended with a singed apron and a firm declaration that some things were better left to the men. But it was in the house where she truly shone. As autumn deepened toward winter, she transformed the place from a mere shelter into a home. Curtains appeared at windows that had been bare for years, not Martha's delicate lace, but sturdy gingham that let in light while keeping out drafts. The perpetual layer of dust disappeared, replaced by the shine of well-polished wood and the scent of baking bread that seemed constant. The nights grew colder, and they grew closer. The physical side of marriage, which had seemed so impossible those first awkward weeks, became not just natural, but necessary. Margaret was nothing like Martha in bed either. Where Martha had been shy and passive, Margaret was enthusiastic and uninhibited, her laughter ringing out at the most inappropriate moments. The hands will hear, John protested one night as she giggled at something he'd whispered. Let them. They should know you're taking proper care of your wife. She pulled him closer. Besides, after that bed-breaking incident, I think our reputation is already established. The story of the broken bed had somehow made it to town. John suspected Billy, who couldn't keep a secret if his life depended on it, and had become something of a legend. Just last week, Harold Morrison had slapped John on the back and winked, saying something about sturdy furniture for a sturdy woman. John had been mortified, but Margaret had laughed until she cried when he told her. November brought the first real snow, transforming the landscape into something from a fairy tale. Margaret stood at the window that morning, her hand pressed to her stomach, a strange expression on her face. "You all right?" John asked, coming up behind her. John, I think I might be pregnant." The words hung in the air like suspended snowflakes. John felt his heart stop, then start again at double speed. "Are you sure?" "No, but I've missed my monthly and I've been sick in the mornings." "I didn't want to say anything until I was certain, but—" He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "A baby. Would you be happy?" "Happy?" He pulled her against him, lifting her off her feet in his enthusiasm. "Margaret, I'd be the happiest man in Wyoming." She laughed, tears streaming down her face. "Put me down, you fool! You can't go throwing pregnant women around." But the joy was short-lived. 3 days later, Margaret woke in the night crying out in pain, blood staining the sheets. The baby, if there had been a baby, was gone before it had really begun. John held her as she sobbed, her body shaking with the force of her grief. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry." "It's not your fault," he told her over and over. "These things happen. We'll try again." But privately, he wondered if this was his punishment for not appreciating her from the start, for wanting her to be something she wasn't. The God who had taken Martha seemed determined to deny him children with Margaret too. Margaret took to her bed for a week, not from physical necessity, but from a sadness that seemed to press her into the mattress. John brought her meals, sat with her in the evenings, held her when she cried. It was a reversal of roles. He was used to being the one wrapped in grief while life went on around him. "I wanted it so much," she whispered one night. "A piece of you and me mixed together into something new." "We'll have children," he promised. "When you're ready, when you're healed, we'll try again." "What if I can't? What if I'm too old, too fat, too—" "Stop." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You're perfect. You're my wife, and you're perfect, and we'll have a dozen babies if you want them." "A dozen?" She managed a weak smile. "We'll need a bigger house. Then we'll build one." It was Sally Jenkins who finally drew Margaret out of her depression, arriving uninvited with a basket of food and a determination that rivaled Margaret's own. "You've been in this bed long enough," she announced, throwing open the curtains. "The quilting circle needs you." "I don't—" "Yes, you do. We're making a quilt for the widow Patterson, Tom's mother, and we need your Irish chain stitch. Besides, moping never helped anyone." Margaret looked at John, who shrugged. "Don't look at me." I'm not arguing with Sally Jenkins. So Margaret rose, dressed, and went to the quilting bee. She came home that evening with color in her cheeks and gossip on her lips, more like herself than she'd been in 2 weeks. "Did you know that Constance Garrett's daughter ran off with a traveling salesman?" she told John over dinner. "And Emily Morrison is expecting again. Her 5th. The woman's a saint or a fool. I can't decide which." John watched her chatter, saw the life coming back into her eyes, and felt something ease in his chest. They'd weathered their first real storm as a couple, not the physical storm that had destroyed the chicken coop, but the emotional one that could have destroyed them. That night, as they prepared for bed, Margaret paused in brushing her hair. "John, do you ever regret it, writing to that agency ending up with me instead of what you wanted?" He thought about it seriously, as she deserved. Thought about the slim, quiet wife he'd imagined, the ghost of Martha he'd tried to conjure. Then he looked at Margaret, strong, vibrant Margaret with her quick wit and generous heart, her capable hands and infectious laughter. "No," he said honestly. "I got exactly what I needed, even if I was too stupid to know it at first." She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen since they'd lost the baby. "Good, because you're stuck with me now, John McKenna. Through cattle disease and storms and broken beds and everything else this frontier can throw at us. Wouldn't have it any other way." December arrived with a vengeance, temperatures dropping so low that water froze in the buckets before they could carry it from the well to the house. The cattle huddled together for warmth, their breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. It was the kind of cold that killed, and everyone knew it. We need to bring the weakest stock into the barn, Tom said, ice crystals in his beard. Going to lose them otherwise. So they spent days moving cattle, cramming as many as they could into the barn and the lean-to they'd hastily constructed. Margaret worked alongside them, her face red with cold, never complaining even when her fingers went numb in her mittens. It was during one of these cattle-moving operations that disaster struck again. A young steer, panicked by the crowding, broke free and charged directly at Margaret, who was carrying a bucket of feed. "Margaret!" John's shout came too late. The steer hit her full force, sending her flying into the fence. She hit with a sickening crack and crumpled to the ground. John was beside her in seconds, his heart in his throat. "Margaret? Margaret, talk to me!" She groaned, her eyes fluttering open. "Did anyone get the number of that cow?" "Don't joke. Where does it hurt?" "Everywhere." She tried to sit up and gasped. "My ribs. I think something's broken." They got her into the house, and John sent Billy racing for the doctor while Tom helped him get Margaret comfortable. She was pale, her breathing shallow and pained, but she kept trying to make light of it. "At least it wasn't the chickens," she wheezed. "Would hate to be done in by poultry." Dr. Weber, when he finally arrived, confirmed 2 broken ribs and a spectacular collection of bruises. "You're lucky," he told Margaret as he wrapped her torso tightly. "Could have been much worse. A woman of slighter build might have been killed." "Hear that?" Margaret said to John. "My sturdy construction saved me. Still think you got swindled by that matrimonial agency?" But John couldn't joke about it. The image of her lying still on the ground haunted him. That night, as she lay propped up in bed, trying to find a position that didn't hurt, he sat beside her, unable to stop touching her, her hand, her face, her hair. "I thought I'd lost you," he admitted quietly. "Takes more than one ornery steer to take out Margaret McKenna." But her bravado faltered. "I was scared too." The recovery was slow and frustrating for a woman used to constant motion. Margaret spent the next 2 weeks confined to bed on doctor's orders, her ribs making even breathing an effort. John had never seen her so still, and it unnerved him more than he cared to admit. She was like a caged bear growling at anyone who suggested she needed to rest. "I can at least sit in a chair and peel potatoes," she argued on the 10th day, trying to swing her legs out of bed despite the obvious pain it caused. "You'll do no such thing." John gently but firmly pushed her back against the pillows. "Tom and Billy and I have managed to feed ourselves before you came along." "Barely," she muttered. "I've seen what you call cooking. Burned beans and leather that might have once been beef." But she was right to worry. Without Margaret's hand in the kitchen, meals had returned to their previous sorry state. Billy had attempted biscuits that could have been used as ammunition, and Tom's stew had somehow managed to be both burned and raw simultaneously. Even John's attempt at her beef stew recipe had resulted in something gray and unidentifiable. It was during this time that Sally Jenkins proved herself a true friend. She arrived every other day with casseroles and fresh bread, staying to help with the washing and to keep Margaret company. The other church ladies followed suit, and soon the kitchen was fuller than it had been since Martha's funeral. "They're doing this for you, not me," Margaret said one afternoon, watching from bed as Constance Garrett scrubbed her floors. "Don't be ridiculous," Sally replied, plumping Margaret's pillows. "You're one of us now. Besides, we owe you for teaching us that Irish chain stitch. Emily's quilt won first prize at the county fair thanks to you." Christmas was approaching, though it seemed wrong to think of celebration with Margaret still healing and the ranch hanging on by a thread. But on December 20th, she insisted on getting up, ribs or no ribs. "It's my first Christmas as a married woman in my own home," she declared, wrapping herself in shawls against the cold. "I won't spend it in bed like an invalid." She moved slowly, carefully, but with determination. By evening, she'd managed to bake a passable apple pie, though John had to take it out of the oven for her when the reaching proved too painful. "We should have a tree," she said suddenly over dinner. "A tree?" John frowned. "We've never had a tree." "Never?" She looked shocked. "Not even when... before?" Martha thought they were pagan nonsense. The words came out before he could stop them, and he saw Margaret's face tighten. "But if you want one, no, it's fine. We don't need to change everything just because we'll get a tree. John's voice was firm. Tomorrow. Billy knows where the good pines grow. We'll get a tree, and you can decorate it however you want. Margaret's smile was worth the effort it took the next day to haul a 7-foot pine through 2 feet of snow. Billy and Tom threw themselves into the project with enthusiasm, probably relieved to see some spirit returning to the house. They set the tree up in the parlor, and Margaret directed operations from her chair, telling them where to place the strings of popcorn and dried cranberries she'd somehow managed to make despite her injuries. "It needs something on top," Billy said, standing back to admire their work. Margaret reached into her sewing basket and pulled out a star she'd fashioned from scraps of fabric and bits of broken mirror. It caught the lamplight and threw tiny rainbows across the walls. "Perfect," John said, lifting it to the top of the tree. When he turned, Margaret had tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." "Everything." She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "My mother had a star like that. I haven't had a real Christmas since she died. Just other people's Christmases, watching from the outside." John knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "This is your Christmas, Margaret. Your home, your tree, your family." "Family," she repeated softly, looking at Tom and Billy, who were trying to pretend they weren't listening. "Yes, I suppose we are a sort of family, aren't we?" Christmas Eve brought unexpected visitors. First came Reverend Mills and his wife with a ham and an invitation to Christmas service. Then the Jenkinses arrived with their children, bearing gifts of preserves and knitted scarves. Even Harold Morrison stopped by with a bottle of good whiskey and a gruff apology for overcharging them earlier in the year. "Seems the whole town's decided to adopt us," Margaret said after the last visitor left. "They've decided to adopt you," John corrected. "I'm just the lucky bastard who married you." The word slipped out, crude and unexpected, and Margaret laughed so hard she had to hold her ribs. "John McKenna, did you just curse? What would Martha say?" "Martha's not here," he said simply. "You are." That night, Christmas Eve, they sat by the tree, the fire crackling in the hearth, snow falling silently outside. Margaret had managed to make hot cider, and the spicy scent filled the room. Tom and Billy had retired to the bunkhouse with extra portions of pie and promises of a proper Christmas dinner tomorrow. "I have something for you," Margaret said suddenly, producing a wrapped package from behind her chair. "Margaret, we agreed no gifts. We can't afford—" "I made it. Open it." Inside was a shirt, beautifully sewn from fabric she must have bought before her injury. The stitching was perfect, each button carefully placed, but it was the embroidered initials on the pocket, JM in elaborate script, that made his throat tight. "When did you—" "At night, when you were asleep. Do you like it?" "It's perfect." He cleared his throat. "I have something for you, too." He retrieved a small box from the mantel, nervous suddenly. "It's not new, but I thought, well, open it." Inside was a cameo brooch, delicate ivory against black onyx. Margaret gasped. "It was my mother's," John explained. "Martha never wore it, said it was too old-fashioned, but I thought you might—" "It's beautiful." She pinned it immediately to her dress, her fingers trembling slightly. "Are you sure? You're my wife. My mother would have wanted you to have it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire, the tree lights twinkling in the darkness. Then Margaret spoke, her voice soft. "I know you still love her, John. I know I'll never be first in your heart, but I need to know, is there room for me too, not instead of her, but alongside?" John considered his words carefully. "When Martha died, I thought my heart died with her. I thought I'd never feel anything again except duty and loss. But you—" He turned to face her fully. "You've brought me back to life, Margaret. Not the same life I had before, but something new. Something I didn't know I could have." "Is that enough? Something new?" "It's everything." He kissed her then, gentle and careful of her ribs. "You're everything I didn't know I needed." They made love that night for the first time since her injury, slowly and carefully, John terrified of hurting her further. But Margaret was insistent, pulling him closer despite her winces of pain. "I need this," she whispered. "I need to feel alive, to feel yours." Afterward, they lay entwined, the snow still falling outside, the tree still twinkling in the parlor below. "Next Christmas," Margaret said drowsily, "we'll have a baby to put under that tree." "God willing," John agreed, though they both knew the pain of that hope. The new year of 1901 arrived with a blizzard that trapped them in the house for 3 days. The temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the windows, and they had to keep fires burning constantly to keep from freezing. They lost more cattle, found them frozen, standing up like statues in the field when the storm finally passed. "How many?" Margaret asked, though she could see the answer in John's face. 20 head, maybe more. We're still counting." It was a devastating blow. Combined with their earlier losses, they were down nearly a quarter of their herd. The mortgage payment had been made thanks to Margaret's money, but they had nothing left for supplies or repairs. "We could sell my mother's brooch," Margaret offered, touching the cameo at her throat. "No." John's voice was firm. "We're not that desperate yet." But they both knew they were approaching that point rapidly. It was Tom who came up with a solution, or at least a possibility. "There's talk of a big cattle drive coming through from Texas, heading to Montana. They'll need extra hands. Pay's good, $100 a man for 2 months' work." "You thinking of signing on?" John asked. "Was thinking you might. You and Billy both. I can manage here with Mrs. McKenna for 2 months." "Leave Margaret?" The thought made John's chest tight. But $100, $200 if Billy went too, could make the difference between keeping and losing the ranch. "Absolutely not," Margaret said when he broached the subject. "You're not leaving me here for 2 months. It's good money." "I don't care if it's all the money in the world. We just found each other, John. You're not riding off into the sunset like some dime novel cowboy." But as January progressed and their situation grew more dire, even Margaret had to admit they were running out of options. The credit at Morrison's was exhausted. They were down to eating beans and cornmeal, the same meal 3 times a day. The remaining chickens had stopped laying in the cold, and they'd had to butcher the milk cow just to have meat. "I'll go," John said finally, one night in late January. "Just me. Billy stays here to help Tom and you." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then, "When?" "Drive comes through in 2 weeks." 2 weeks. She stared at the ceiling. "And then 2 months gone." "I'll come back." "You better." She rolled over to face him, her eyes fierce. "You better come back to me, John McKenna, or I'll track you down myself and drag you home by your ears." The next 2 weeks passed too quickly. Margaret threw herself into preparations, mending every piece of clothing John owned, cooking and preserving what food she could for his journey, all while pretending her heart wasn't breaking. The night before he left, they clung to each other desperately, making love with an urgency that had nothing to do with passion and everything to do with fear. "What if something happens?" Margaret whispered in the darkness. "What if you get hurt or sick or nothing will happen?" "You can't know that. This frontier takes people, John. It takes them and doesn't give them back. Not me. Not when I have you to come home to." The morning of departure dawned clear and brutally cold. The cattle drive was assembling at the stockyards outside town, hundreds of longhorns and dozens of cowboys, a sea of horns and horses and dust despite the snow on the ground. John kissed Margaret goodbye at the ranch, not wanting to prolong the parting in public. 2 months, he promised. "I'll be counting the days." She pressed something into his hand, a lock of her auburn hair tied with a ribbon. "So you don't forget me." "As if I could." He rode away without looking back, knowing if he saw her standing there, he'd lose his nerve and return. The drive moved north slowly, and it was 3 days before they were properly out of Wyoming territory. The work was brutal. 18-hour days in the saddle, nights sleeping on frozen ground, constantly vigilant for stampedes or rustlers or weather that could kill man and beast alike. John had worked cattle all his life, but this was different. This was survival at its most basic. 3 weeks into the drive, they were hit by another blizzard. John watched 2 men freeze to death, unable to help them, unable to do anything but huddle with the other survivors and pray. He thought of Margaret then, warm and solid and alive, and held on to that thought like a lifeline. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Margaret was fighting her own battles. 2 days after John left, rustlers struck, taking advantage of the depleted defenses. They got away with 10 head of cattle before Tom's rifle fire drove them off. "Should we wire John?" Billy asked, nursing a graze on his arm from a rustler's bullet. "No." Margaret's jaw was set with determination. "He's got enough to worry about. We'll handle this." She organized the ranch like a general preparing for siege. She had Tom teach her to shoot, really shoot, not just wave a gun around. She set up watch schedules, installed new locks on the barn, even rigged noisemakers around the perimeter that would alert them to intruders. "You're something else, Mrs. McKenna," Tom said admiringly, after she'd successfully fought off another rustler attempt single-handedly, leaving one man with buckshot in his rear as he fled. "I'm a woman protecting what's hers," she replied, reloading the shotgun with grim efficiency. But the challenges weren't just external. 5 weeks after John left, Margaret realized she was pregnant again. The familiar nausea, the tenderness, the missed monthly, all the signs were there. This time, she told no one, not even Sally Jenkins, who'd become her closest friend. She couldn't bear the thought of losing another baby while John was gone, of having to face that grief alone. She hid her morning sickness, blamed her exhaustion on the extra work, and prayed constantly that this child would hold on, would wait for its father to come home. The cattle drive, meanwhile, had reached Montana, but barely. They'd lost a third of the herd to cold and predators, and several men had given up, heading for the nearest town rather than completing the journey. John stayed, driven by the thought of the money and the woman waiting for him. The trail boss, a grizzled Texan named Cooper, pulled him aside one night. "You're pushing too hard, McKenna. Gonna kill yourself at this rate. Got someone to get back to." "Wife?" "Yeah." Cooper nodded knowingly. "First year?" "First year." "Then you better make it back in one piece." "First year's the hardest. If you can survive that, you can survive anything." They were a week from the end point when disaster struck. The herd, spooked by wolves, stampeded in the middle of the night. John, on watch, tried to turn them, but his horse stumbled in a prairie dog hole. He was thrown hard, his shoulder slamming into a rock, his horse rolling partially over him before struggling back to its feet. When the other cowboys found him, he was unconscious, his shoulder dislocated, ribs cracked, blood seeping from a gash on his head. They wanted to leave him at the nearest town, but John refused. "I finished the drive," he gritted out through the pain. "I get paid, then I go home." So they strapped him to his saddle, and he rode the last week in agony, every step of his horse sending lightning through his body. But he made it, collected his $100. Then began the long journey home. Back at the ranch, Margaret had received no word for weeks. The drive should have been done by now. John should have been on his way back. But there was nothing. No letter, no telegraph, no word from other cowboys returning south. "He's fine," Tom assured her. "Drives always run late. Weather's been bad up north." But Margaret knew something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the winter weather. She stood at the window each evening, watching the road, willing a familiar figure to appear. "Please," she prayed to a god she wasn't sure listened to fat Irish governesses. "Please bring him home. This baby needs a father. I need my husband." It was March 15th, 2 weeks past when John should have returned, when Billy spotted a rider approaching. Margaret was in the garden, trying to coax early vegetables from the cold soil, when she heard his shout, "Rider coming!" "Looks like—" "Mrs. McKenna, it's him. It's the boss." Margaret ran, her skirts flying, her heart pounding. But as the figure grew closer, her elation turned to fear. John was slumped in the saddle, barely holding on, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. "John!" She reached him just as he started to fall, catching him with strength she didn't know she possessed. "John, what happened? Where are you hurt?" "Margaret," his voice was a whisper, "made it home." They got him inside, into bed, and Margaret's worst fears were confirmed. His shoulder was infected where it had been dislocated, fever burning through him. His ribs were definitely broken, and the head wound, while healing, had clearly been serious. "How long have you been riding hurt?" she demanded, cutting away his filthy clothes. "Week, maybe more, lost track." He caught her hand weakly. "Had to get home. Had to get back to you." Dr. Weber came, shaking his head at the extent of John's injuries. Miracle he made it this far. The infection's bad, Mrs. McKenna. I won't lie to you. It's going to be touch and go. He'll make it, Margaret said firmly. He's too stubborn to die. For 3 days, John burned with fever, delirious, calling out for Martha, for Margaret, for his mother who'd been dead 20 years. Margaret never left his side, bathing him with cool water, forcing broth between his lips, talking to him constantly. You listen to me, John McKenna, she said during the worst of it, when his breathing was so shallow she could barely see his chest move. You don't get to leave me. Not now. Not when I'm carrying your child. You hear me? We're having a baby, and you're going to be here for it. Whether he heard her or not, she couldn't tell. But she kept talking, telling him about the ranch, about the rustlers she'd fought off, about the vegetables she'd planted, about the future they were going to have together. On the 4th day, the fever broke. John opened his eyes, truly seeing her for the first time since he'd arrived home. Margaret. I'm here. She was crying, she realized, tears streaming down her face. I'm here, my love. You said, did you say baby? She nodded, unable to speak through her tears. When? October, I think, if I can keep it. The fear crept back into her voice. If we don't lose this one too. We won't. His hand, still weak, found hers. This one's a fighter, like its mother. Who fought off rustlers while you were gone? She informed him. Shot one in the ass with your shotgun. John laughed, then winced as it jarred his ribs. That's my girl. Your girl, who's furious with you for nearly dying on her. Don't you ever do that again. No more cattle drives, he agreed. The $100 isn't worth it. $150, Margaret corrected. Cooper sent a man down with extra. Said you more than earned it with what you went through. It took weeks for John to fully recover. Weeks during which Margaret fussed over him like a mother hen, driving him crazy with her constant attention. But he loved it, loved her, loved the way she'd held everything together while he was gone. Tom says you turned into a regular frontier woman, he said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Spring was finally arriving, the snow melting, green shoots pushing through the earth. I did what I had to do. She rested her hand on her belly, which was just beginning to round. For our family. Our family. John covered her hand with his. I like the sound of that. The ranch slowly recovered along with John. The extra money from the drive helped, allowing them to buy new stock and repair winter damage. Margaret's garden began producing early vegetables, which she sold in town for extra income. The chickens, replaced and thriving, provided eggs that were also in demand. By May, Margaret was definitely showing, her belly round and firm beneath her aprons. The pregnancy seemed to be progressing well, though she remained cautiously optimistic, afraid to hope too much. It was Sally Jenkins who organized the baby shower, despite Margaret's protests that it was bad luck to celebrate before the birth. Nonsense, Sally declared. This baby's going to need clothes and blankets whether you celebrate or not. The baby shower was held on a warm June afternoon, the ranch house filled with more women than it had ever held. They brought quilts and tiny clothes, wooden rattles and knitted booties, each gift accompanied by advice that ranged from practical to absurd. Margaret sat in the center of it all, her face glowing with a mixture of embarrassment and joy, one hand constantly resting on her expanding belly. You're carrying high, Constance Garrett observed with the authority of a woman who'd birthed 6 children. That means a boy. No, Emily Morrison disagreed. Look how she's spread all around. That's definitely a girl. Margaret caught John's eye through the window, where he was pretending to work on the fence but actually watching the proceedings with barely concealed interest. He grinned at her, and she felt that familiar flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the baby's movements. As summer progressed, Margaret grew larger, her already substantial frame expanding to impressive proportions. She waddled more than walked, had to turn sideways to fit through doorways, and could no longer see her feet. But she remained determinedly active, insisting on maintaining the garden, cooking all the meals, even attempting to help with the lighter ranch work, until John physically carried her back to the house. I'm pregnant, not dying, she protested as he deposited her in a chair. You're 8 months pregnant and the size of a barn, he countered. You need to rest. Did you just call your pregnant wife a barn? A beautiful barn, he amended quickly, kissing her forehead. The most beautiful barn in Wyoming. She threw a dish rag at him, but she was laughing. The heat of August was brutal, and Margaret suffered more than she let on. Her ankles swelled to twice their normal size, her back ached constantly, and sleep was nearly impossible. John would find her standing by the window at night, fanning herself with whatever was handy, tears of frustration rolling down her cheeks. "I'm too big," she said one particularly miserable night. "This baby's going to be enormous. What if I can't? What if something goes wrong?" "Nothing's going to go wrong," John assured her, though privately he shared her fears. She was indeed enormous, larger than any pregnant woman he'd ever seen. "Dr. Weber says everything's fine." "Dr. Weber's never birthed a baby himself," Margaret muttered. "What does he know about it?" The first pain came on September 3rd, while Margaret was hanging laundry. She gasped, dropping the wet sheet she'd been pinning to the line, her hand going to her belly. "John!" Her voice carried across the yard. "John, I think it's time." What followed were the longest 18 hours of John's life. Margaret labored through the day and into the night, her cries echoing through the house. Sally Jenkins and Agnes Mills took turns helping, while John paced the hallway like a caged animal, forbidden from the birthing room by tradition and the women's fierce protectiveness. "She's too narrow," he heard Dr. Weber say at one point, his voice worried. "The baby's big, and she's built wrong for this." "She's built just fine," Sally's voice snapped back. "She's strong as an ox, that one. She'll manage." But as Margaret's screams grew weaker, more exhausted, John couldn't stand it anymore. He burst into the room despite the protests, finding Margaret pale and sweating, her eyes glazed with pain. "John," she whispered, reaching for him, "I can't. It's too hard." "Yes, you can." He took her hand, feeling her grip with surprising strength. "You're the strongest woman I know. You fought off rustlers, survived that storm, brought this ranch back to life. You can do this. Stay," she pleaded. "Please stay." To hell with tradition. John stayed, holding her hand, whispering encouragement, being her anchor as she fought to bring their child into the world. And finally, as dawn broke on September 4th, a baby's cry filled the air. "It's a boy!" Dr. Weber announced, holding up a red, squalling infant who looked enormous, even covered in birth fluids. "Good Lord, he must be 10 pounds at least." 10 pounds, 4 ounces, Sally confirmed after weighing him. "No wonder you were the size of a house, Margaret." "You were growing a giant." Margaret, exhausted but radiant, held their son for the first time, tears streaming down her face. "He's perfect," she whispered. "Look, John. We made this. We made him." John, who hadn't cried since Martha's funeral, found himself sobbing as he looked at his son, their son. The baby had Margaret's coloring, reddish fuzz on his head, and gray eyes that seemed to take in everything with serious consideration. "What shall we call him?" Margaret asked. "James," John said without hesitation, "after my father. James Thomas McKenna." "Jamie," Margaret murmured, touching the baby's cheek. "Little Jamie." The recovery was slow. The birth had been hard on Margaret, leaving her weak and bedridden for weeks, but she insisted on nursing Jamie herself, despite offers from other women to help. John would find them in the early morning light, Madonna and child, Margaret singing Irish lullabies while Jamie fed greedily. "He's going to be as big as his mother," Tom observed, watching Jamie drain what seemed like his body weight in milk. "Bigger," Billy predicted. "Look at those hands. He'll be a giant." Indeed, Jamie grew at an alarming rate. By 3 months, he was the size of most 6-month-olds. By 6 months, he was crawling with the determination of a cavalry charge, getting into everything, his chubby hands grabbing at anything within reach. "We're going to need a bigger house," Margaret said one evening, watching Jamie attempt to climb the stairs. "Especially if we have more children." "More?" John raised an eyebrow. "This one nearly killed you coming out." "Well, maybe not right away," she conceded. "But Jamie needs brothers, sisters. A family. He has a family. He has us." "A bigger family," Margaret insisted. "This house should be full of children, John. Full of life and laughter and chaos." As if to emphasize her point, Jamie chose that moment to pull himself up on the coffee table and send a lamp crashing to the floor. His delighted giggle at the destruction was so infectious that both parents found themselves laughing too. Winter came early that year, but they were ready for it. The ranch had recovered from its earlier disasters, the cattle healthy and numerous, the barn full of hay, the cellars stocked with Margaret's preserved vegetables and meats. They'd even managed to save a little money, enough to feel secure for the first time since John had started the ranch. On their first wedding anniversary, John surprised Margaret with a new bed, a massive oak construction that looked like it could withstand an earthquake. "Guaranteed not to break," he said with a grin. "The furniture maker in town swears it could hold a full-grown bull." "Are you comparing me to a bull now?" Margaret asked, but she was smiling. "Never. But I figure with you, me, and Jamie all piling in some mornings, we need something sturdy." It was true that Jamie had taken to climbing into their bed at dawn, his cheerful babbling serving as a more effective alarm than any rooster. Margaret would pull him between them, and they'd lie there as a family, watching the sun paint the walls gold, feeling complete in a way John had never imagined possible. But peace on the frontier was always temporary. In February, with snow piled high against the windows and the temperature brutal even by Wyoming standards, disaster struck again. This time it came in the form of men, 5 riders who appeared at the ranch just after sunset when John was in the barn and Margaret was alone in the house with Jamie. She heard the horses first, too many for visitors, moving too quietly for honest men. Her blood went cold as she recognized the deliberate stealth of their approach. These weren't neighbors coming to call. "Mrs. McKenna!" The voice from outside was rough, unfamiliar. "We know you're in there. Come out nice and quiet-like, and nobody gets hurt." Margaret's mind raced. John and the hands were in the barn, probably couldn't hear the men over the wind. Jamie was upstairs in his crib, asleep. The shotgun was by the door, loaded since the rustler incidents. "What do you want?" she called back, buying time. "Your husband took something from us. We're here to collect what's owed." "My husband's not here," she lied. "Come back tomorrow." The laughter outside was ugly. "Nice try, lady." We saw him go into the barn. "Now open this door or we'll break it down. Wouldn't want your baby to get hurt in the commotion, would we?" The threat to Jamie changed everything. Margaret felt a rage rise in her that was primal, maternal, terrifying in its intensity. She grabbed the shotgun, checked it was loaded, then called out sweetly, "Just let me get my shawl." "It's cold." She opened the door with the shotgun already rising, catching the men by surprise. The first blast took the leader in the shoulder, spinning him off the porch. The second sent another man diving for cover, but there were 3 more, and she only had 1 gun. The sound of gunfire brought John running from the barn, Tom and Billy behind him. What followed was a fierce firefight, the night lit up with muzzle flashes, the air thick with gun smoke and curses. Margaret barricaded herself inside with Jamie, reloading the shotgun with shaking hands, firing through the window at any movement. It was Billy who took the first hit, a bullet catching him in the leg, sending him down with a cry. Tom dragged him to cover while John advanced on the attacker's position, his rifle spitting fire. One of the outlaws tried to flank the house, and Margaret dropped him with a blast that peppered his legs with buckshot. "You shot my brother, you bitch!" one of the remaining men screamed. "Come closer and I'll shoot you too!" Margaret screamed back, all trace of the civilized governess gone, replaced by a frontier woman defending her home. The battle might have gone on longer, but the sound of multiple horses approaching made the remaining outlaws panic. Sally Jenkins' husband Robert had heard the gunfire and gathered several neighboring ranchers. The outlaws fled into the night, leaving their wounded behind. "Margaret!" John burst through the door, his face white with fear. "Are you hurt?" "Is Jamie?" "We're fine." She was shaking now, the shotgun sliding from nerveless fingers. "We're fine. But Billy is..." "Tom's with him. He'll make it." John pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "You magnificent, terrifying woman. You held them off alone." "Not alone," she corrected, pulling back to look at him. "Never alone." "Not anymore." The aftermath was complicated. The wounded outlaws were taken to town, where they revealed they were brothers of a man John had helped arrest years ago for cattle rustling. They'd come for revenge, simple as that. The sheriff arrested them, but everyone knew there might be more family, more vengeance seekers. Maybe we should leave, John said that night, as they lay in their sturdy new bed with Jamie between them. Go somewhere safer. California, maybe. Oregon. No. Margaret's voice was firm. This is our home. We've bled for it, fought for it, nearly died for it. I'll be damned if we're running now. It's dangerous. Life is dangerous, but this is where we belong. This is where Jamie will grow up, where his brothers and sisters will be born. This is where we're making our stand. John looked at his wife, his fierce, brave, magnificent wife, and knew she was right. They'd come too far to run now. Spring came late but beautiful, the prairie exploding with wildflowers that carpeted the land in purple and gold. Jamie took his first steps in April, toddling between his parents with arms outstretched for balance, his laughter echoing across the yard. Margaret was pregnant again, though she hadn't told John yet, waiting for the right moment. It came one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. Jamie was playing at their feet, stacking blocks and knocking them down with gleeful destruction. "John," Margaret said quietly, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her, saw the soft smile on her face, the way her hand rested on her belly, and knew. Again? Again. Due around Christmas, I think. Another giant baby. Probably. I don't seem to make small ones. She laughed. Good thing we got that sturdy bed. John pulled her close, kissing her temple. Good thing I got a sturdy wife. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their son play, feeling the new life growing between them, the ranch spreading out before them like a promise. It hadn't been the life either of them had planned. John had wanted a slim, quiet wife to slip into Martha's shadow. Margaret had wanted security and a fresh start. Instead, they'd found something neither had dared hope for: true partnership, deep love, a family built on struggle and strengthened by adversity. "Do you ever think about her?" Margaret asked suddenly. "Martha?" John considered the question. "Sometimes, but not the way I used to. She feels like someone from a different life now, a different man's wife." "You are a different man. The John who loved Martha couldn't have survived what we've been through, just like the Margaret who left Chicago couldn't have fought off outlaws or birthed a 10-pound baby. We've changed each other. For the better, I think. Definitely for the better." As darkness fell and they gathered Jamie to go inside, Margaret paused at the door, looking back at the land they'd fought so hard to keep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did on the frontier. There would be droughts and storms, sickness and health, joy and sorrow. But they would face it all together, this unlikely pair who had found in each other not what they'd wanted, but what they'd needed. "Coming to bed?" John asked, Jamie drowsy in his arms. In a moment. Margaret stood on the porch a bit longer, breathing in the sweet prairie air, feeling the quickening of new life in her belly, remembering the frightened woman who'd stepped off the train just over a year ago. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who'd earned her place on this unforgiving land. "Margaret, I'm coming." She turned, smiling at her husband and son, her family, her home. "I'm home." The story of the mail-order bride who broke the rancher's bed had become legend in the county, told with laughter and increasing embellishment at every gathering. But the truth was both simpler and more profound than any tall tale. It was the story of two broken people who'd found wholeness in each other, of a house that became a home, of love that grew not from passion, but from partnership, from facing life's storms side by side. Years later, when Jamie and his 4 siblings would ask their parents how they met, Margaret would always start the same way. "Your father ordered a slim, obedient wife from a catalog, like he was ordering a plow or a bag of seed. Instead, he got me, all 200 pounds of Irish stubbornness. The poor man didn't know what hit him." And John would add, "Best mistake I ever made. Your mother saved this ranch, saved me, saved everything worth saving. Even if she did break our bed on our wedding night." The children would giggle at that part, never knowing whether it was true or just another frontier tall tale. But Margaret and John would exchange glances over their heads, remembering that night, remembering all the nights that followed, remembering how they'd built a life and a love strong enough to weather any storm. The Double Bar K Ranch prospered over the years, growing from a struggling homestead to one of the most successful cattle operations in Wyoming. But its real success wasn't measured in acres or cattle. It was measured in laughter echoing through rooms once silent with grief, in children racing through fields their parents had nearly lost, in the love between a man and woman who'd started as strangers and became each other's whole world. The frontier had tested them with everything it had: weather, disease, violence, loss. But they'd stood firm. Margaret, with her fierce strength and practical wisdom, John with his steady determination and growing capacity for joy. Together, they'd proved that sometimes the best things in life come not from getting what you want, but from accepting what you're given and making it extraordinary. And if occasionally, on quiet nights, the old bed frame in the attic creaked mysteriously, as if remembering the night it surrendered to a love too big to contain, well, that was just another part of the legend of Margaret O'Connor McKenna, the curvy bride who broke more than just a bed. She broke through grief, through expectations, through every barrier the frontier threw at her. She broke them all, and in breaking them built something unbreakable in their place: a family, a legacy, a love story that would echo across the Wyoming plains for generations to come. The autumn of 1906 found the Double Bar K Ranch transformed beyond recognition. Where once stood a modest two-story frame house, now rose a sprawling homestead with 2 additions, necessary to contain the ever-growing McKenna clan. The porch wrapped around 3 sides now, with rocking chairs that were rarely empty, and a swing that creaked pleasantly in the evening breeze. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, her hands deep in bread dough, watching her children play in the yard. Jamie, now 6 and tall for his age, was attempting to teach his younger siblings the fine art of lassoing fence posts. 4-year-old Sarah, red-haired and round-faced like her mother, kept getting tangled in the rope. 3-year-old Thomas, named for Tom Patterson, who'd died peacefully in his sleep the previous winter, was more interested in chasing chickens. The twins, Robert and Rose, barely 2, toddled after their older siblings with determination that reminded everyone of their mother. "Mama, look!" Sarah called, having successfully thrown the rope around absolutely nothing. "I'm a cowboy!" "Cowgirl-key," Margaret corrected automatically, her Irish accent still coloring her words after all these years. "And keep that rope away from your brothers' necks." She was pregnant again, her 6th child, and at 35 she felt every one of her years. But it was a good tired, a satisfied exhaustion that came from building something worthwhile. Her body, never small to begin with, had expanded and contracted so many times with childbearing that she'd long ago given up any pretense of delicacy. She was what she was, a frontier mother, broad and strong and capable of birthing babies that the midwife now jokingly called McKenna-sized. John entered the kitchen, bringing with him the smell of horses and hay. At 43, his hair had gone silver at the temples, and lines creased his face from sun and wind and laughter. He moved behind Margaret, his arm circling her expanded waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Another one?" he murmured, feeling the baby kick against his hands. "Seems like it's trying to fight its way out already." She leaned back against him, comfortable with his touch in a way that had taken years to develop. "This one's going to be trouble. They're all trouble. McKenna children don't know any other way to be." It was true. Their children had inherited Margaret's stubbornness and John's determination, creating a combustible mix that kept the ranch in constant chaos. Just last week, Jamie had decided to break a wild Mustang by himself and had ended up with a broken arm for his troubles. Sarah had eaten an entire pie meant for the church social and then denied it with berry stains around her mouth. Thomas had somehow managed to let all the chickens into the house while his parents were at town meeting. "We got a letter from Chicago," John said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "From the Worthinghams." Margaret stiffened slightly. She'd had no contact with her former employers since they'd dismissed her in disgrace 6 years ago. "What do they want?" "They want a visit. Apparently they heard about your success out here. Mrs. Worthingham writes that they're touring the Western Territories and would be honored to call on their dear friend, Margaret." Margaret snorted, a decidedly unladylike sound she'd never have made in Chicago. "Dear friend? The woman who accused me of theft wants to visit? Should I write back and tell them not to come?" Margaret considered, her hands still working the dough with perhaps more force than necessary. No, let them come. Let them see what became of the disgraced governess they threw out. The Worthinghams arrived 3 weeks later, their fancy carriage looking absurdly out of place on the dusty ranch road. Margaret had insisted on no special preparations. Let them see how we really live. But she'd also made sure to wear her best dress, the cameo brooch prominent at her throat, her children clean and presentable, at least for the moment. Mrs. Worthingham stepped down from the carriage, elegant and thin as ever, her husband behind her looking uncomfortable in his city clothes. But it was the third passenger that made Margaret's blood run cold. Charles Worthingham, the brother-in-law who'd pursued her, who'd ruined her life in Chicago. "Margaret!" Mrs. Worthingham exclaimed as if they were old friends. "How wonderful you look! And so many children! You've been busy!" "Mrs. Worthingham." Margaret's voice was cool, polite. "Mr. Worthingham. Charles?" Charles had the grace to look ashamed, his eyes not quite meeting hers. He'd grown fat in the intervening years, his face florid with too much drink, his hands soft and useless looking. "This is my husband, John," Margaret said, and felt a surge of pride as John stepped forward. Even in his work clothes, he cut an impressive figure, tall, lean, weathered by honest work rather than softened by leisure. "Ma'am, sir." John's handshake was firm enough to make Mr. Worthingham wince. When he got to Charles, his grip became positively crushing. "Heard a lot about you." Charles paled, understanding the threat implicit in those words. The visit was exquisitely awkward. The Worthinghams sat in Margaret's parlor, in her house, on her land, trying to make polite conversation while clearly overwhelmed by the chaos of 5 children and the obvious prosperity of the ranch. "You've done very well for yourself," Mrs. Worthingham finally said, a note of disbelief in her voice. "Yes, I have." Margaret poured tea from her good china, the set she'd bought with her first profit from selling vegetables. "Despite certain challenges in Chicago." "About that," Charles suddenly spoke up, his voice strained. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. What I did, what I said, it was wrong, unforgivable." Everyone stared at him. Mrs. Worthingham looked confused. "Charles, what are you talking about?" "I lied," he said flatly. "Margaret never stole anything. I accused her of theft because she refused my inappropriate advances. I destroyed her reputation out of spite." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Worthingham's face went white, then red, then purple with rage. "You did what?" What followed was a scene that would become another McKenna family legend. Mrs. Worthingham beat her brother-in-law with her parasol while calling him names that no one expected a society lady to know. Mr. Worthingham had to physically restrain his wife while Charles cowered, trying to protect his head from the assault. 6 years! Mrs. Worthingham shrieked. 6 years! I've believed this lie. Margaret was the best governess we ever had. And you vile, despicable. "I think," John said calmly, "you folks should leave now." As the Worthinghams collected themselves to depart, Mrs. Worthingham turned to Margaret with tears in her eyes. "I'm so very sorry. Can you ever forgive me?" Margaret looked at the woman who had cast her out, who had believed the worst of her without question. Then she looked at her children, her husband, her home. "You did me a favor, Mrs. Worthingham. If you hadn't dismissed me, I'd never have come west. I'd never have found John, had my children, built this life. So yes, I forgive you, but I don't forget." After they left, Charles slinking away like the coward he was, John pulled Margaret into his arms. "That must have felt good." "It felt like closing a door," Margaret said, "on a room I never need to enter again." That winter was the hardest yet. A blizzard in January lasted 5 days, snow piling up past the windows, the temperature dropping so low that water froze solid in the pipes. They lost 30 head of cattle, frozen, standing in the fields like ice sculptures. But they survived, the family pulling together, the older children helping with the younger ones, everyone working to keep the fires burning and the animals alive. It was during this blizzard that Margaret went into labor with their 6th child. With no way to get to town for the doctor, John had to deliver the baby himself. with Jamie boiling water and Sarah watching the younger children. "This is not how I planned this," Margaret gasped between contractions. "When has anything in our life gone according to plan?" John asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite his terror. The baby came fast and fierce, like the blizzard outside. Another boy, smaller than the others at only 8 pounds, but with a cry that could wake the dead. "What should we call him?" Margaret asked, exhausted but triumphant. "Storm," John said immediately. "William Storm McKenna, because he came with one." "That's a terrible name," Margaret laughed weakly. "Let's call him William. Will for short." As she nursed the new baby, surrounded by her family, warm and safe despite the howling storm outside, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. 6 years ago, she'd stepped off a train expecting one life and found another entirely. She'd wanted security and got adventure. She'd expected loneliness and found love. She'd planned for survival and achieved prosperity. "Do you ever regret it?" John asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Writing to that agency, coming west?" "Never," Margaret said firmly. "Not for 1 second." Spring brought unexpected visitors, a film crew from back east making what they called a moving picture about the real American West. They'd heard about the McKenna Ranch, about the mail-order bride who'd become a frontier legend, and wanted to capture their story. "Absolutely not," Margaret said at first. "I won't have my children turned into some circus show." But the filmmaker, an earnest young man named Theodore, persisted. "Mrs. McKenna, your story represents everything that makes America great. The courage to start over, the strength to persevere, the power of family. People need to see that the West isn't just cowboys and Indians. It's families like yours, building something from nothing." In the end, Margaret agreed, but only if they showed the truth. The hard work, the struggles, the daily reality of ranch life. The film crew spent a week following the family, capturing Margaret cooking for a dozen ranch hands, John breaking horses, the children doing chores and lessons. The most powerful moment came when they asked Margaret to tell her story directly to the camera. She sat in her kitchen, flour still dusting her hands, children playing in the background, and spoke simply and honestly. "I came west because I had no other choice. I was a disgraced governess, too fat and too Irish for polite society. John wanted a slim, quiet wife to replace the one he'd lost. Neither of us got what we expected." She smiled, looking off-camera at John. "We got something better. We got each other, and we got this life we've built together. It hasn't been easy, nothing worth having ever is, but it's been ours." The film, when it was finally shown in theaters across the country, made Margaret briefly famous. Letters poured in from women who saw themselves in her story, who took courage from her example. Several even came west themselves, looking for their own second chances. One letter stood out from the rest. It was from a young woman in Boston, heavy-set and Irish, working as a maid and facing harassment from her employer's son. "Your story gave me hope," she wrote. "If you could build such a life, perhaps I can too." Margaret wrote back immediately, offering advice, encouragement, and something more: a job. "We need a school teacher for the local school. Room and board included, and all the protection of the McKenna name. Come west, dear girl, find your courage." The young woman, Mary O'Brien, arrived that fall and became part of the extended McKenna family, eventually marrying Billy Chavez and starting her own frontier story. By 1908, the McKenna Ranch had grown to over 2,000 acres, running 500 head of cattle and a string of horses that were becoming known throughout the territory. John had hired more hands, built better buildings, even installed one of the first telephones in the county. But the real growth was in the family itself. Jamie at 8 was already showing signs of the man he'd become: strong, thoughtful, protective of his younger siblings. Sarah at 6 was Margaret in miniature, bossy and loving in equal measure. Thomas at 5 had John's quiet intensity and gift with animals. The twins, now 4, were forces of nature, constantly into everything. And little Will at 2 was the spoiled baby, doted on by everyone. "We need to stop," Margaret said one evening, her hand on her belly where yet another baby grew. 7 children, John. Where will we put them all?" "We'll build more rooms," John said easily. "Maybe a whole new wing." "With what money?" "The money from the horses. That stallion I've been training, Man from Denver wants to pay $1,000 for him. $1,000. It was more money than Margaret had ever imagined having when she'd stepped off that train 7 years ago. What would Martha think of all this? She asked suddenly. John was quiet for a moment. I think she'd be happy. Happy that I found someone strong enough to survive this life, to thrive in it. She knew she wasn't built for it, Margaret. Near the end, she told me to find someone who was... She did? She said, find a woman with strong hands and a stronger heart. Find someone who can birth babies and break horses and stand beside you when the storms come. I thought she was delirious from the fever. He pulled Margaret close. Turns out she was prophetic. The 7th baby came on a golden autumn day, the easiest birth yet. A girl with John's dark hair and Margaret's gray eyes, whom they named Martha. Are you sure? Margaret asked when John suggested the name. I'm sure. It's time to honor the past while celebrating the present. Little Martha grew fat and happy on her mother's milk and her siblings' adoration. She would never know the fragile woman she was named for, but she would carry forward the memory transformed, not of weakness, but of grace, not of loss, but of love's continuity. The photograph taken that Christmas became the one everyone would remember. The entire McKenna family gathered on the porch of their sprawling ranch house. John standing tall and proud, Margaret seated in the center like a queen surrounded by her court, children arranged by height like stair steps, even the ranch hands and their families included in the frame. It was sent back east and published in newspapers with the caption, "The Real American Family, the McKennas of Wyoming." But perhaps the most telling moment came one evening as Margaret was putting the children to bed. Sarah asked, "Mama, tell us again about how you and Papa met." Margaret sat on the bed, Martha in her arms, the other children gathered around. Well, your Papa ordered a bride from a catalog, like he was ordering seeds for planting. He asked for someone slim and quiet and biddable. What's biddable? Thomas asked. Someone who does what they're told without question. The children laughed at this absurd idea. Their mother, biddable? But what he got, Margaret continued, was me. All 200 pounds of Irish stubbornness, with opinions about everything and a voice loud enough to call cattle home. And you broke the bed, Jamie added gleefully. That's right. Broke it clean in half our first week married. Your Papa looked at me like I'd broken his whole world apart. She smiled at the memory. Turns out I had. Broken it apart so we could build something better from the pieces. Was Papa disappointed? Sarah asked. Margaret thought about those first difficult weeks, the comparisons to Martha, the struggle to find their way to each other. Maybe at first, but you know what? Sometimes God doesn't give us what we ask for. He gives us what we need, even when we're too foolish to know we need it. Like when I asked for a pony and got a bicycle instead, Thomas offered. Exactly like that. Your Papa needed someone strong enough to save the ranch, to fight off rustlers, to birth big babies and raise wild children. He needed someone who could stand beside him through everything this hard land could throw at us. He didn't know he needed that, but God did. And you, Mama? Jamie asked. What did you need? Margaret looked at her eldest son, already so much like his father. I needed a home. A real home, not just a roof over my head. I needed children of my own to love, not other people's children to tend. I needed a man who would see past what I looked like to who I really was. She shifted Martha to her other arm. I needed your Papa, though Lord knows I didn't expect him. As the children settled into sleep, Margaret made her way downstairs where John was going over the ranch accounts. She paused in the doorway, watching him work by lamplight. He was no longer the bitter widower she'd met at the train station. The years had weathered him, but also softened him, laugh lines replacing the grooves of grief. The children asleep? He asked without looking up. All 7 of them. She moved behind him, her hands on his shoulders, though I doubt it'll last. The twins have been plotting something all day. When aren't they plotting something? He covered her hand with his. We've done all right, haven't we? For 2 people who started out all wrong? We've done better than all right. She leaned down to kiss his temple, then straightened with a groan. Though my back may never forgive you for all these babies. I recall you being an enthusiastic participant in the making of them. John McKenna. She swatted his shoulder, but she was laughing. What would the church ladies say? Probably the same thing they said when they heard about the broken bed, that John McKenna got more than he bargained for with his mail-order bride. You certainly did. Thank God for that. He stood, pulling her into his arms, this woman who had saved him in every way a person could be saved. Thank God for catastrophic shipping errors and broken beds and stubborn Irish women who don't match their descriptions. And thank God for Wyoming ranchers who learn to love what they're given instead of mourning what they ordered. They stood there in the lamplight, holding each other, listening to the familiar sounds of their home, the wind against the windows, the settling of old wood, the occasional giggle from upstairs where the twins were definitely not sleeping. It was a sound Margaret had never heard in all her years as a governess in other people's homes, the sound of belonging, of being exactly where she was meant to be. The legend of the curvy bride who broke the rancher's bed would be told for generations, growing with each telling. But the truth, as Margaret and John knew it, was both simpler and more profound. It was the story of two people who'd found in each other not what they'd wanted, but what they'd needed. Who'd built from disappointment a joy neither had imagined possible. And if sometimes, on quiet nights, when the children were finally asleep and the ranch was peaceful, they still broke furniture with their enthusiasm for each other. Well, John had learned to build things stronger, and Margaret had learned that some things were worth breaking. The Double Bar K Ranch stands to this day, though it's grown beyond anything John or Margaret could have imagined. Their descendants still tell the story of the mail-order bride mix-up, though the details have been polished smooth by time. What remains is the essential truth, that love comes in unexpected packages, that strength isn't always visible at first glance, and that sometimes, just sometimes, not getting what you want is the greatest gift of all.